I'm already hesitating. Today, I'm again going to be engaged, at least some, in an exercise in self-flagellation. Uh, I once more will be reading something that I wrote many years ago. Let me see actually when I wrote this. Uh, well, it's something I wrote in 1972, and then it got published as a chapter in a book. What's the date on this? It was published in a book in 1976, so 4 years later, it appeared in the book. And there's a story about the book, and there is the actual contribution I made to the book that I want to read. The book is The Naked Therapist, and it's edited by Sheldon Kopp. Uh, some of the people who look at this episode, some of the few people who know, look at this episode, probably know who Sheldon Kopp was. He was a very dear man. He was a psychologist in Washington, D.C. I met him at an APA convention. We were on a symposium together, and I really liked him. And later, I was a young man then, very young. And later on, I read his book that he was very pleased with having put out, and it's a classic in the field. The title of that book that he wrote is "If You Meet Buddha on the Road, Kill Him." And I thought the book was wonderful. I loved his audacity. I loved his coming at problems in a different way than we were taught to think about them. And I just liked him as a human being. Uh, so the following happened. The other one of the other themes running in my life was I was out of graduate school. I was trying to build my practice in 1974 when I wrote the original manuscript. I was 33 years old, and I had been out in the field for 5 years at that time. And my colleagues that I worked with in my group practice knew that I liked writing, and each one of them in their own way felt a responsibility. We should be out in the public of the profession. We should be donating time to professional organizations because we were still trying to build a profession back then. And if we could get referrals too, there was a selfish reason for doing it if we became more visible in the professional community. So I was encouraged to start writing things, which I did. And I started presenting things at LACPA and at the Los Angeles Society of Clinical Psychologists. So I was presenting every year in one or the other of those forums. Oh, and my ring light just went out again. It has a mind of its own. Excuse me for a second. Okay, it's back. And I was totally lost. I had been trained in very traditional psychoanalytic thought and psychoanalytic tactics, as I previously have said on many occasions. And I was out in the real world where uh, the clientele was not appropriate for the method. You had to be really Yavis in order to benefit from psychoanalysis. You had to be young, attractive. What's the V stand for? I forgot what the V stands for. Intelligent and sophisticated.
Maybe
Oh,
vocal, I think. It was a vocal.
oh yeah, all
Yeah,
right,
yeah, yeah.
maybe vocal. Yeah. And that's only a small part of the population that was engineered by nature to be able to participate in psychoanalysis, put up with the cost of it and the frustrations. Obviously, you had to have a reasonable amount of money because it was expensive to go to therapy 4 times a week. And so, what the hell had I been trained to do? I was trained for a clientele that was not the clientele that was showing up to ask for my help. It was also a time right after graduate school where there was an explosion. Up until my graduation, there had been just three ways of thinking about working with clients. One was traditional psychoanalysis. The other was the application of Skinnerism, of behavioral principles to reconditioning clients. And the third was Carl Rogers, who was just beginning to develop client-centered psychotherapy. And that was it. Well, in the decade after I left, there was now an explosion of all kinds of things. Gestalt therapy was coming on, primal skin therapy was coming on, cognitive behavioral therapy was coming on, all these experiments and fermentation of possibilities was happening. And I was well adrift. I was moving away from what I've been trained to do. I was listening to other things, going to workshops, listening to presentations, trying to figure out who the hell was I? How was I going to address the issues the clients brought me in the future? What was going to be the conceptual framework I was going to work in? And I felt quite lost. I was also so pissed off because uh, I read journals, I listened to presentations. Everybody who was showing up said, here is what's important when you work with clients, and these are the principles you should follow. Here are some case examples, and you can learn from the case examples how powerful this way of thinking is. Every cult leader had reasons for why you should join the cult. And I knew from my own experience that I was failing occasionally, maybe even more than occasionally. I once saw a statistic, I think, that we should expect when we get referrals that about 13% of them are not going to pan out. They're going to have negative reactions to being with us, or they won't stick with us at all. And that bothered me. The thing that bothered me was everybody was bragging how wonderful they were. There was no research that I ever saw published that said we were convinced that X, Y, and Z should be done with this kind of clients, but we tried it and it bombed. Didn't work at all. There was no such literature. And I was joking with my friends. I said I wanted to start a literature of negative therapeutic outcomes. Those should be the articles that we publish. What people tried to do and laid an egg trying to do it, because that would be as illustrative and important as them bragging that everything was wonderful if you just got inside their particular tent. I knew enough to know that that was bullshit, but I was lost. And then one day I said, well, let's try this. Why don't we try featuring negative therapeutic outcomes? So I put together a symposium for APA that year. I was going to go to the big stage, not just a little stage of our local here. I was going to go to where the APA convention was, and hopefully I would have many people who would come listen because I liked the title I came up with. It was Negative Therapeutic Outcomes and What Caused Them. And each of the participants would talk about the worst mess they had ever made. I thought, gee, we'll get a really good audience. At about that time, too, I had volunteered to be an examiner for the licensing exam. And I started to take great pride in asking a question that was not part of the protocol we were given to ask. I wanted to ask each one who was going to get licensed, what's the worst mess you ever made with a client? Tell us about it and tell us what you learned from that. One of my principles was if somebody couldn't come up with something or was too scared to come up with something like that, they shouldn't be a psychologist. We should look at our mistakes, own our mistakes, learn from our mistakes, and be able to talk about it. So here I was doing what I said needed to happen in the field, particularly as we sorted through a whole rising plethora of different ways to think about the work we were doing. Oh my God, the number of articles and books that were being written was enormous. Even psychoanalysis itself was moving on and beginning to try out different kinds of things. So I put the symposium together, and the five participants there were, four participants and a discussant I had chosen. And they were people I had met from around the country. And I must say, I think I was the only one that really talked about a hideous mess I'd gotten into. The others were doing a kind of yes, but yeah, well, this didn't work exactly well. But in the end, I did X, Y, and Z, and I was able to rescue it. Chicken shit people on my symposium. But the most terrible part was there were only 6 people in the audience. I said, what the hell? I found out later when I looked at the schedule that Carl Rogers and B.F. Skinner were having a debate. And they were having a debate in a big auditorium, and the hall was filled to the overflowing, and people were out in the halls with loudspeakers trying to hear them. So nobody came to my stupid symposium. I think I've told you guys on another occasion. After that, I said to the people who were on my symposium, next year we're going to do a symposium on the indications for when sex with clients is justified. And that's the symposium we're going to put on. And I'm sure we'll get a big crowd if we do that. But anyhow, I had prepared this manuscript. Nobody had listened to it particularly. There was nobody there. And I thought that maybe maybe I could get it published somewhere. Maybe so I did. I got a shortened version of it published. And then I was having breakfast one day with Sheldon Kopp and a few other people. We were all going to attend a certain meeting together, and I was happy to see him that year. And he said, "I'm looking around for another book. I have a publisher wants me because I turned out to be quite saleable. The publisher wanted me to come up with something, and I feel dry right now. I don't have a topic." And so I came up with my topic. How about you editing a book on negative outcomes in psychotherapy? And again, the story of the writer's worst disasters and what they learned from them, and get eminent psychologists if you can to contribute that. So that's how the book was born. He did get a publishing contract. He called it The Naked Therapist. And the line underneath on the paper here says, "A Canterbury Tales, a collection of embarrassing moments from more than a dozen eminent psychotherapists." So he says, "It's a go. I certainly want a contribution from you." And I said, "Okay, I have something I worked on." Is it okay? It was published in a shorter version in a journal. And he said, "Sure, this is a compendium of things. There's no reason it couldn't have had a previous publication." I said, "I think I want to embellish it anyhow. I want to extend it some more and get really more deeply in it. I don't think I struggled with it successfully enough. So thank you for the opportunity. When is the deadline by which I have to give you a manuscript?" And I wrote it, and I was thrilled. I was excited. And I want to apologize right now. I was too lost in God knows what not to have been horrified by what I had written. Because when I looked at it many years later, it's a nightmare to look at. And my blindness and my insensitivity and my cruelty to the client is just so embarrassing to me. And I'm so ashamed of how I treated this person. At the time, I was running on an old script. It had started in elementary school and it went on through all my life. The script was, look how smart I am. Look how articulate I am. Look what a leader I could be. And I was pushing that and singing it over and over again. I was so excited. Of course, I was deeply involved. By the time this got published, I had just married Hermine. I wanted her to read it right away. And she said, "I don't know if you should publish this." And I said, that was a deep disappointment to me. This was such a wonderful thing I had written. And she's telling me she wasn't sure I should publish it. I said, "You know what? I'm having a senior moment too. My good friend." God damn it. I've forgotten his friend. I'm blocking on it. My friend, I'm blocking on it now. He was somebody who had been an undergraduate at UCLA with me. He was also a psychology major. So we wound up in many classes together and we became very, very good friends. we were so different. He came from Eastern Jewish aristocracy. He came from a very wealthy family in Connecticut. He was always dressed impeccably. He had a hot sports car he was driving around with. He went to Nantucket for summer vacations. He was going to go to graduate school at Yale, and he was really hot. And he was very kind to me, even though he had a big trust fund. He was never nasty to me. He was very accepting. We had a nice friendship. He not only went to Yale and got a PhD, he decided he was going to go to the Analytic Institute at the Menninger Foundation. He was going to pursue analytic training after graduate school. He didn't need to go to work right away. He had plenty of money to live on. So he went off to Menninger for the 5 years of his training, and then he became a staff psychoanalyst at the Menninger Foundation. So he was coming for a visit to Los Angeles. He had friends here, including me, and he was going to be here right after I wrote this. And so I gave it to him and said, "You're going to be around a few days. I'd appreciate it if you took a look at this. I think this is really wonderful." My wife said she doesn't know if I should publish it, but take a look at it. You've always been very decent. I trust your judgment. You're a very wise man, and I'd appreciate your feedback. Well, he read it and he said to me, "This probably should be published, but I don't know what you thought you were doing." And I said, maybe I'll revise it some. I'll try and make the rationales for moves I made at certain moments. Maybe I'll try and make that clearer. He said, "It certainly was a disaster, and you've been brave in putting that out there, but I feel like Hermine does. Are you sure you want to publish this?" And I said, "Yeah, I have a commitment. It's going to be published. And I think when it's published, people will see it and they'll think it's wonderful too. I know I will get some brownie points for having been so courageous as having laid my soul bare and to write this damn thing. But I think people will see the wisdom and the cunning of some of the things I was trying to do with her. I think that's enough by way of introduction. I will get into the manuscript itself, and I may stop haltingly in places to talk about what I wish I had done differently, why this seems horrible to me, why I'm ashamed of myself, and all the rest of whatever reactions I'm having while I go through this. Damn, I need to remember my friend's name. Maybe I will before I'm done, because I want to give homage about something else. The title of this manuscript is, and the title is very appropriate, The Valley of the Shadow. The thought of saying the things I am about to say has filled me for days now with a great deal of fear. Fear that seems to have a twofold Janus-facing nature. On the one hand, the story I shall relate leads me back through events in my life that are incredibly painful to revisit. On the other hand, my memory of the interactions between myself and the patient I shall introduce to you stirs primordial apprehension in me. I was raised on shame and have suffered its effects all my life. I sit here in the fear of the judgments of you who shall listen to this. 5 months ago, when I conceived the idea of this symposium, I was filled with what seemed like a driven need to discuss the experiences I had just lived through with the patient I shall describe. As today came closer and closer, however, the need seemed to wane, and I found it harder and harder to think about what I would say to you. I said to myself that it was losing its importance, but I want you to know that part of me was always suspicious of that. I now know that I was giving myself phony excuses, that the journey you and I shall make together fills me with dread, and that I am terrified and uncertain about that journey. I discovered this for sure on Friday morning. I knew I could no longer put off giving some thought to what I would say to you, using the rationalization that the press of other involvements made it impossible to reflect about my story. I awoke with a start just before dawn. Kaleidoscopic images of scenes now gone flashed through my awareness with stark clarity. I felt their poignancy. I felt gathering me a point of view, a schema for relating to you, a set of notions that might make sense out of me to me. These I will share with you. I commend to you my life as a psychotherapist and as a man. The central notion that I choose to affirm and that shall illuminate these remarks is that the style of the calling of a psychotherapist cannot be separated from the great themes of his or her own existence. We delude ourselves often that our task consists of our merely executing a set of well-learned techniques in the service of our patients' needs. I now know that this formulation is nonsense. What we do with our patients, whether we do so deviously and cunningly or overtly and brashly, is to affirm our own identities and the struggle with their struggles. We use them, for better or worse, to secure precious nourishments, to preserve our sanity, to make our lives possible, and to reassure ourselves in the face of that ineffable dread that lurks always beyond the margins of our awareness and can be heard as a very quiet electric hum emanating from the depths of our souls when everything is silent. Listen right now and you shall hear it if you dare. But most of us ourselves go through some form or another of protracted therapy to convince ourselves that we thereby have grown beyond such primitive dread and that we have transcended that basic human need to inflict our personhoods on all whom we comfort. In this way, we can use our training to utter comfortable lies to ourselves and to avoid looking at the processes by which the persons we are either catalyze or defeat those who move in communion with us. But enough of my convoluted poetic philosophy of human commerce. It is time for me instead to introduce you to Gwen and to relate to you how my personal longing quest failed to provide that which she needed from me and produced what? Disaster, chaos, stalemate? I do not even know the right word to describe the outcome. Each of you can provide your own word when I am through. What I am about to relate, however, is the tale of an era in the development of the person who was this psychotherapist, me. And at that time of my life, as you shall soon see, I was filled with shame, guilt, and anxiety. Part of me needed a persecutor, and Gwen supplied the potential to play the part. She and I came together around this theme. When I no longer needed to be persecuted, we somehow parted. But I am getting ahead of my tale. I first met Gwen about, I can't even remember how many years ago, and I perversely choose not to look it up. I know that it was more than 4 years ago and less than 8. The important thing to say to you about the time frame of our relationship, and subjective time is always more important than objective time, is that she was a companion to me, often a vicious companion, during the death of my first marriage and the birth of my second marriage. For those of you who have never experienced that process, marital transition, as it is lived on the threshold of middle age, I have few words to describe to you what that incredible journey feels like. I shall mutely content myself with saying that it is a time of agony, desperation, and great craziness, often carried out with no self-awareness. And I also need to tell you that I appreciate that the words I have just uttered communicate nothing to anyone who has not lived through such a death, and that for the others of you who have been my companions, the words are superfluous. At any rate, Gwen came into my life at about the same time as I began to stop pushing away the awareness that my first marriage was dying. She was then about 19, a freshman in a local city college. And I noticed immediately that she was very tiny, cute, appeared cuddly to me, and at the same time had some kind of prickly quality to her that made it hard for me to talk to her. As fragments of the tape in my head now unwind, what I remember most from our first moments together, aside from the visual images of her appearance, is how I felt as if I kept reaching to make contact with her as I fashioned my words, and how she would then slap at my verbal pseudopod, implant a barb in it, slide to one side, and look at me in both defiance, tricking me, and despair that she had won. Years later, when I talked to her about that dance that unfolded over and over between us, she stared silently at me in baleful hatred. Gwen came to see me because she had begun to experience severe anxiety attacks in school. Most of these were evoked by encounters with her psychology instructor, a married middle-aged man. She was convinced in her own paranoid fashion, to which I was unutterably blind in the beginning, that he was making seductive, obscene, and shaming gestures towards her continually. When he discussed masturbation in his lectures, she believes that he was shaming her before the whole class, accusing her and revealing that she was a masturbator. She would blush, feel terrified, and have to leave class. Gwen was frequently aware of his genitals bulging in his trousers. She often believed he dressed in a fashion to accentuate them and positioned himself in such a way as to exhibit his endowments to her. When he talked about sexual matters, she knew he was lusting after her. I need to make it clear that, as I do so often, I partly trusted Gwen's craziness and indeed believed there was something in the instructor that longed for her. She was, I must repeat, deadly cute. At that time in my life, I cherished two precious beliefs that I then believed provided the golden key to the good life. These beliefs now seem shattered, empty, discarded in despair, as a long series of previous shining beliefs have been interned. But then my beliefs have a way of turning to ashes every few years and winding up on my personal scrap heap of broken longings. At any rate, during the time I am describing, I believe first that each person needed to listen very carefully to the secret longings his or her heart whispered, and needed to strive mightily to turn those longings into reality. I also believed, second, that every conflict between human beings could be resolved by the resolute willingness of the parties involved to contend with each other openly and to express themselves fully and authentically. With these beliefs goading me on, I urged, suggested, prodded, exhorted, and insisted that Gwen confront her instructor and that she share with him not only her paranoid perceptions of his lustfulness and his provocations, but also what had been becoming more obvious to us both, her longing to have an affair with him and her fear that she might. Gwen at last did so. She sought him out one evening at his office and poured out her feelings and perceptions to him. The instructor became incredibly defensive and poisonous with her at that meeting. He treated her with arrogance and contempt and was completely unwilling to examine if he had any of a role in her craziness. After coolly berating her for 15 minutes and attempting to convince her that everything was the fabrication of her sick mind, he hugged her when it was time for her to leave his office. She was aware of his penis. I'm going to stop for a second. I think the second of my values, the need for authentic encountering with the other, was stirred in me by a workshop I had seen Fritz Perls run. I was in partly the sway of the importance of some of Gestalt perceptions about how people should live and how we should interact in the consulting room. The particular thing I'm remembering is that he did an experiential workshop. People in his audience were invited to come up and present whatever they were struggling with, and he would deal with them. He would work with them in the same way he would work with any client who had brought him a problem. One of the people who came up to him was a middle-aged woman who said that she loved to sing, and she was a member of a volunteer choir that actually went various places and sang. And it gave her great pleasure to do that, even though that was not her career. But in recent months, something was happening. Her voice seemed to be closing up and her windpipes seemed to be closing up, and she was having harder to sing with any intensity and to project her voice out over other people's voices and into the audience. And Fritz Perls looked at her and said, that's what you would like me to help you to resolve? And she said, yes. He promptly took one step closer to her, put his hands around her throat and started to choke her. He was really choking her. And she screamed and she fought. And it took some time for her to get his arms off of her. And she was screaming very loudly. And he stopped when she got his arms off her and said, there, you're fixed. And that was his intervention. And I didn't know what to make of that. I was very drawn to it in some way. It seemed abusive. He seemed like an arrogant prick. And yet she had screamed. He had found some way, some vector into her that freed her to be able to scream loudly and not mince around anymore. So some of my brashness with the client, just go tell him what's you are feeling all these things. Go say it to your instructor. I was in the middle of the Gestalt enterprise with her, and I had not anticipated. He was a professor of psychology of all things. I thought you would get some kind of kind response. It seemed like a reasonable response, but instead he traumatized her even more now. I didn't appreciate how much I was traumatizing her, even giving her instruction to go do that. When she returned to her next appointment, she was furious with me. She screamed at me that I was a rotten fucker, that I had sent her to her humiliation, that I took sadistic pleasure in teasing her. The force of her violence was incredible. Her features contorted into a malevolent hatred that I have seldom seen. For the first time, I sensed the presence of some awesome murderousness in her, and I felt frightened. The pitch of her screaming was louder than I had ever heard. I believe, and I still do, that the instructor had manipulated her and given her a dose of clever poison to choke on, as he protected himself from her paranoid wisdom. I tried to get her to hear that. Her ears were closed by the noise of her own anguish, vicious screaming. She broke out of my office, fleeing from me and from her rage, almost wrenching the door off its hinges, although she probably did not weigh more than about 95 pounds. I did not see her again for several months. I must pause now in where the flow of my reveries carries me. I'm going to stop. The name of my friend was Stephen Applebaum. It did come back to me, and I loved him even more, even though he was not so happy with what I had written, because at the Manager Foundation, he too, after 5 years on staff, began to question what he was doing as a psychoanalyst. And he, like I was reading all kinds of other things. He was reading Gestalt literature. He was reading humanistic literature. He was reading the literature again of people who had been in the analytic movement and had broken away from it in disappointment. He was consuming as much as he could. And I remember now in his 7th year, he put in a request to be given a year sabbatical. And what was he going to do? He was going to go as a patient and sample 28 different kinds of psychotherapies he identified that were out there competing in the literature for some attention from professionals. And he wrote a book about his experiences. He wrote a book called Out in Inner Space, because that's where he went. He went out of the Menninger Foundation and into his own inner space as guided by a whole variety of different kinds of psychotherapists that were asking him to attend to this, that, and the other thing. And he came back profoundly troubled by this. He couldn't function in the same way. He began to get in trouble with his colleagues. They felt like he was losing it somehow. He was typical in a cult. He was falling away from learned vision. He wound up leaving the Menninger Foundation. His wife was a training analyst there. She trained people in child analysis. There was even tension between the two of them, and he just went into independent practice as a psychologist in Topeka, Kansas. But he stopped being a member of the analytic movement. So he too, at that time in life, was struggling with what is this all about? What should we learn? What is useful? What is craziness? What can we weave together? And I think each of us has to do that own unique challenge by ourselves. And every one of us will come to a different conclusion and pick up different strands out of which we will weave the tapestry of our calling. But back to my narrative. I know I want to talk about those 2 beliefs I mentioned before that were so precious to me and so profoundly influenced by my commerce with Gwen, for better, for worse. You see, I needed desperately to believe in both the principles I described to you, that heeding the whisper of one's heart and daring to encounter the other bravely would together make life bearable. The mortal sadness of my marriage was then killing me. The beliefs in question showed me a way, gave me a direction. They gave me a justification for doing 2 things that I badly needed to do. I found the courage to have the first of what turned out to be several love affairs in my attempt to create for myself that which had been lacking in my empty life, to assuage the ache that had been leading me to walk, staring always at the ground with lead in my groin. And I found the even greater courage to begin to speak the unspeakable to my former wife and to lance the painful abscesses of hidden and festering silences that had existed between us for over a decade. My belief inflicted on Gwen and most others who opened themselves to me were my armor, my sword, and my shield at that time in my life. Will I ever dare to walk the road of my life naked? The next many months, Gwen found exquisite ways to torment me, even though I could not get her to come to my office. She began, for example, to call me, usually around 3 in the morning. I would stagger out of bed to answer the phone. There would be an ominous silence, then a loud screaming, "You goddamn piece of shit, I want you to die," or something equally vicious and abusive. Suddenly the phone would be hung up, and if it would be over until the next time. I believed then that my life was in the grip of some malevolent, overwhelmingly crushing principle. For Gwen's timing was exquisite. Most of her calls occurred at times when I felt too weary, too battered to stand one more moment of anguish in my life. My struggle to build a new existence was beginning to consume me. Most of those nights I had fallen into a fitful sleep after lengthy episodes of bitter acrimony with my former wife, or of crying desperate tears at having to cross such a limitless desert alone. Gwen's calls would cause me to start up from steamy, sweat rumpled sheets in terror. I did not feel the strength to deal with her. She would punish my eardrums. I would submit, and then I would stagger back to my nightmares. At last, after an absence of 4 months, I finally received a daytime call from Gwen. She asked to make an appointment. When she came in, she told me she had been thinking about her therapy a lot and she felt she wanted to enter group therapy. Having others around would, she believed, keep the two of us from getting into terrible trouble together. I often notice patients possess incredible wisdom if we would only listen. I also, as did she, wanted and needed to dilute the horrible intensity of what had been transpiring between us. I readily assented, and Gwen started group. To my surprise and delight, she began to work in ways she had not before, and the effects of that work also began to result in some changes in her life away from therapy. Thus, she cultivated a relationship with a childhood sweetheart and surrendered her virginity to him. She also began to feel and act in many other ways, much more like an age appropriate 19-year-old. I learned a great deal more about the chaos of her past during those months, too. Her parents had been divorced when she was 6. Her mother remarried when Gwen was 12 after a period of intense economic hardship filled with illness and hunger. In her middle adolescence, Gwen's stepfather had a psychotic episode preceded by a period of great violence during which he brandished a pistol repeatedly, screamed at his family members, often in desperate viciousness, and engaged in great raging hallucinatory battles with his wife, during which he sometimes bloodied her or broke her bones before he himself finally went to a psychiatric hospital. Gwen trembled violently as she remembered and related these things. During this period of treatment, also, Gwen got herself a job as a secretary, decided to attend college at night, and moved into her own apartment, separating from her family for the first time in her life. And I felt smug, pompous, and marvelously effective as her therapist. What an ass I was. More vignettes now flood my awareness. A weekend marathon. I had begun to become interested in this therapeutic modality and had begun to explore its dimensions. Gwen accompanied me several times. Once I was working with another patient. The other patient was pouting, sullen, withholding. She'd come to the edge of something and now sat stolidly, defiantly, unyieldingly. I became exasperated and started shaking her in a smaller version of what Fitzburrows had done with his client. The next thing I knew, Gwen threw herself at me, fist flailing, screaming, "You fucker, you fucker." It took 10 people to pry her off of me. I was very shaken. Another marathon. Days, months, years, I do not know how much later. I had taken 20 patients into the Sierra Nevada. We were camped out in a snow-surrounded, glacially scoured, lake-filled paradise. I had asked a woman along to share my sleeping bag at night. As I look back, I now feel ashamed of my choice. My companion was young and very pretty, but had nothing more for me than sexual compliance. For this, she wished to present with me. She wished to present me with a large number of emotional demands. At that period of my life, I was desperate for any crumb of nourishment, did not appreciate my worth, and would hunger after anyone I believed would have me. We fought a great deal that weekend. Gwen kept watching the two of us balefully. During the second day, she asked the largest man in the group to restrain her physically while she talked to me. He did so, and once again she shifted gears into her screaming viciousness, calling me a piece of shit, a motherfucker, any obscenity she could muster. How would I dare to have sex in my sleeping bag with one of the people who came on that weekend? This was before the board of psychology had moved in on this kind of predilection. He held her so she wouldn't hit me. She struggled hard to get free while she vilified me. The gist of her tirade was, of course, that I was a moral leper, a biosensualist, and a user of people. I'll pause for a moment. It now seems very apparent that the amount of trauma that Gwen had sucked up while she was growing up was enormous. And the one trauma it hadn't occurred to me to inquire about was whether she had been molested by her stepfather. It seemed so apparent to me the first time I read this, some years after I had written it. And it never occurred to me all the time I was with her that that trauma is one she was frightened of and relived over and over again. Or I was going to do it to her. And the fact that I was going to bed in a sleeping bag with one of my patients didn't give her much encouragement that I wouldn't do that to her. Her psychology professor, those many months before, was going to do it to her. The whole world was full of men who were just waiting to rape her. Back to my narrative. As my first marriage continued to die, and as I searched for the goodness I so longed for, Gwen became somehow in my mind the world's representation of the established moral order. She had been selected to make me suffer for my sinful attempts to make a new life. My sexual adventures, my being willing to move out of the home and give up being a full-time caretaker of my own children, many, many sins I was going to commit and was in the middle of. The night calls and screaming at me over the telephone continued after that marathon weekend, usually when I could least bear them. Incredible vituperation also spilled out of her at our regular group meetings each week. A memory now erupts into my awareness. It is a soft spring Monday morning. Los Angeles is scented and fresh, scrubbed clean by the warm desert winds. To the left, I see mountains over my shoulder, the Pacific with Catalina Island rising out of it. My gaze as the car I am driving seems to pulsate effortlessly towards my office. I am exhausted. I had cried myself to sleep the night before. Weekends were always terrible when marriages are dying. Gwen had called again. I want her dead. I suddenly knew it and began to fantasize the myriad ways I could kill her. I danced exultantly over her broken corpse. Her life must end so that mine could go on. Yes, I knew it and hungered for the moment when vengeance would be mine. That shitty, stinking little cunt bitch. I arrived at work trembling in the fearful awe over the intensity of my own murderousness. That night in group, my patience was exhausted. The two of us got into a screaming battle with each other. I told her how I longed for her to die. We traded insults and murderous fantasies. I felt momentarily better. I had let it all hang out. That should be healing for her. Another night, weeks later, I am talking to someone about masturbation. Gwen's paranoia flares up again. She accuses me of sitting with my legs apart to compel her to stare at my crotch. She insists that I'm talking about masturbation to shame her. She yells that I should get it straight once and for all that she does not masturbate. I get furious. I call her a stupid little bitch. I tell her that she is 20 years old and it's time she started masturbating. I describe to her how to do it and order her to go home and carry out my instructions after group. I add that I never again want to hear anything about masturbation from her. She becomes silent. Finally, I start searching my heart about her accusations. I tell her that they are partly justified, that when I first met her, I had indeed tried her on in fantasy as a possible lover. I asserted that I had probably teased her provocatively and flirted with her in subtle ways. I admitted to her the crazy desperation that seized most of my life then, the hunger to be at rest in a good woman's arms. I added that my fantasies about her had died, though, soon after getting to know her, that she was not my other half, nor what I needed for me. I said that I regretted that fact. I believed that my inability even to imagine her any longer as a partner to me was a sad tragedy. I felt forlorn as I talked to her. I closed the group by expressing my wish that a day might come before either of us were dead, when once again she could stir in me such a way as to invoke in me the imagery of her being my woman. I knew that that would be a sign that something profound had happened in each of us. And I cannot tell you how ashamed I am of myself as I read these words to you about what I thought, what I said, and what I inflicted on her. Early the next morning, Gwen called. She asked if she could have an individual appointment with me. I had a cancellation that afternoon and readily assented. At the appointed hour, I opened the waiting room door. Her face was contracted with rage. As she walked by me, she slapped my face. When we entered my office, I asked her what the hell that had been for. She screamed that I had exposed, shamed, and humiliated her in front of her friends and group. I'm sorry I never said that I exposed, uh, shamed, and hated myself even more than I did her. And I humiliated myself 1,000 times worse than I had humiliated her in front of the group. Then she went berserk and threw herself on me, trying to claw my face and spitting at me as we tussled. I crashed to the floor, spilling furniture and books everywhere. I finally subdued her, and as she began to feel the assertion of my strength and control, she murmured between clenched teeth, "Go ahead, you bastard, fuck me." I told her I wasn't interested. She began to sob convulsively. I had never seen her like that. She was suddenly very little and helpless, a 3-year-old who had been running around in murderous fury, trying to pretend that she had adult competencies, lest the world penetrate her disguise and annihilate her. An image is indelibly burned into my awareness. The two of us sitting there on the floor in the midst of the rubble of my office, Gwen sobbing helplessly in my arms, my rocking her and feel rubber-kneed and weak from the awe and fearfulness of what we had just experienced. And I think it's time for me to stop unfinished at that point. And I think I'm blushing in shame. But even in the writing of this, I was still following the lead that I had to be real, I had to be authentic, I had to express fully everything, and I certainly did so in the writing of this article.
You succeeded in that.
God. All comments are welcome at this point.
Wow. I'm wondering, Arthur, if the and I don't know if we would call it countertransference on steroids, but if there was some countertransference going on with you because of kind of like the transitions that you were going through from one marriage to the other.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. And
That's
but-
what I said at some point in the thing. What we receive is received by a human being, and the human being is not perfect, and the human being doesn't just listen objectively and then dispense interventions.
were you
I was a human mess that she was talking to.
right? But were you aware of any of this as you went through this?
Yes, but I had my tools for getting through it. One was to just express everything authentically, and that would get me through it somehow. to everybody,
Mm.
to any new person I would meet in my life, to my friends, to my colleagues, to my clients. Just say everything.
Mhm.
It's as if I took the filter off my tongue.
Hmm.
She saw me. That's what I was.
You definitely met her with your Rogerian quivering humanness in all its raw forms. Yeah.
But some of it was quite abusive to her because she wasn't meeting my needs properly. And she was calling into question the tool I was using. It seemed not to be working. It seemed to be driving her increasingly desperate and crazy.
Yeah.
How would you do things differently now?
Quite a bit, I imagine.
I would listen to her with kind attentiveness. I would try to be as soothing as I possibly could. I would try to have compassion for how hurt she was and not try to rush anywhere with her to do anything, but mainly try and create a relationship in which she felt that she could be real and tell me things she needed to tell me. And I would listen with kindness and receive her in a peaceful and sustaining way. That's what I would be doing. Maybe I had to go through this to get there. I don't know, but I'm sorry for her that I had to put her through that. She certainly was a powerful experience that did start to shatter that way I had of construing things and what I thought was important, not only in life, but all the consulting room. There was no difference in any relationship anywhere.
It really illustrates the wild west of psychotherapy at the time.
Oh, and
Yeah.
there were so many of us that were doing similar
Yeah.
things.
How did things end for her with you? I mean, how?
That's in the rest of the story. You will hear how it is.
Okay. All right. Okay.
I'm about 2/3 of the way through and I will finish next week.
I see. Okay.
Not well. Remember, if all this had led to some good outcome, it wouldn't be in the book because this was supposed to be a book about failures.
Mhm. Mm.
And well, I will. Again, I'll take some stupid pride. I bet you this is the most amazing and raw and crazy failure of any of the chapters in the book. I won the prize.
I bought the book when you mentioned it.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, I found it on eBay. You were in good company. Albert Ellis is in there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But every one of them managed to brag about how they rescued disaster. I seem to remember. I haven't looked at it in any detail since then.
Yeah.
Good, I still out there. I bet you it sold at least 10 copies.
Probably.
Maybe more. I don't know.
The back of the, I think they call that the back of the file effect. Basically, all the studies that don't get published because they weren't, they didn't prove the point. It's a similar concept. No one wants to talk about things that went wrong.
Mhm. Let's see. I wanted to read before I say goodbye. What did they put about me on the dust jacket?
Yeah, I was gonna make sure you read that because I thought
Yeah.
that was that's a little bit profound. I thought that was really a good description.
Yeah, Arthur Kovacs, the founding campus dean of the California School of Professional Psychology. Yes, it was important to me that that be put there because this was published in the year the campus opened.
Yeah.
So I wanted to add legitimacy to our program by saying, look, I'm the dean and I'm publishing something in an important book. He has been in the private practice of psychotherapy for the past 19 years.
Only 19. What a
Yeah,
baby.
yeah. He has stated his belief that, quote, every psychotherapist who wishes to remain alive must eschew dogma and create his beliefs, his techniques, and his style in a very personal and lonely way. I now subscribe to no orthodox religion whatsoever, close quotes. He is the author of numerous articles and papers. I still believe that.
Yeah. Yeah.
but I'm sorry I had to pick up every one of the threads that was out there and try and put every one of them in my tapestry somehow. And I was fascinated with some of them that I think were really ugly and itchy threads that shouldn't ever be put in any tapestry. But maybe I just had to go on that journey to get to my destination. I think of myself now as being quite a kind, a supportive, decent human being showing up to see all my clients. I would never do anything this raw or crazy with any of them.
Yeah, I think you have to kind of hold it in the context of the time of what was going on around you and
And
the field evolving.
you learned.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I did learn. All right. Oh, you can put on the descriptor the name of the book. You can put the
Okay.
the Naked Therapist Part 1.
Okay,
And next week will be the Naked Therapist Part 2.
got it.
Have a good weekend, guys.
Okay,
You too.
Bye.
See you guys
Bye.
later.
all right, bye now.
Bye.